So this is our first video on this boy's life, and we're going to introduce a topic called self-determination theory. Self-determination theory studies human behavior and human values and human outcomes. And they've tried to find those areas of human life that, if mastered, lead people to report that they are thriving, and those areas of life that, if they're lacking, have people report from their lives that things aren't going well and that they're not happy or excited about their lives. They ultimately conclude that there are three areas of life in which people need to excel in order to fully thrive. And the first of these is competence. And competence at the most basic level is being able to do the things that you need to do in your life. So, as a high school sophomore at St. Mark's, a decent amount of athletic competence is helpful, like competence as a writer and basic mathematical competence and some social competence, right? Beginning to be able to talk to other people romantically, or being able to meet people from another team and get along with them, and so as an adult, right, you're going to need to be able to get along with people at work. You're going to need to be able to collaborate and cooperate and work in teams and do projects together and probably be a spouse and be a parent, and some people are competent at these things and some people aren't, and some people have high levels of mastery of these tasks and other people are very bad at them. And if they're essential tasks to the life that you're leading and you're not competent in them, then it's just really hard to succeed in life. So it's not just a matter of our values, like, oh, I don't happen to value competence, or I don't happen to value collaboration or cooperation. If your life demands like that you be able to do it, it doesn't really matter if you value it or not in your head. Your life isn't going to go well if you can't do what you need to do to be who you are. And that's an important thing to know. The second element of thriving, according to self-determination theory, is relatedness. And so relatedness is, as it sounds, the ability to relate to other people. And so, again, you might think, well, what if I just don't value relatedness? Well, it turns out that the human organism, in the way it's evolved, generally, almost always, does actually need the affection of other people and relationships with other people. Otherwise, it feels bad and gets depressed. And so the more good friends people have, the more life satisfaction that they report. And so you might, often kids think, if I only just get A's in my classes, everything will go fine for me, and that life is just about some sort of intelligence or something, as opposed to, the social aspects of life, which end up being rather more important than the intellectual aspects of life. When people report on how they're doing, you could be really, really smart and get straight A's and really miss out on the aspects of life that involve sharing with other people and being part of groups. So learning to be effective parts of communities and valued parts of communities and be loved and give love, these end up being vital aspects of thriving. The third element of thriving in self-determination theory is autonomy. And autonomy is probably the trickiest of the three. It involves, at the most basic level, that we have chosen, somebody with autonomy has chosen, based on his own tastes, many of the main activities that he does in his life. So, as you know, you probably feel better when you have choice, right? If you have a bunch of sports you can play or fine arts you can do. If somebody says you have to do ceramics, well, maybe you don't like ceramics. And often, even if you like ceramics, if you have to do it, it's not as enjoyable. So there's a lot of power to having chosen the aspects of your life, your occupation, your spouse, aspects of your life like that. And so But also, there's a sense of autonomy as a kind of open-endedness, a sense that you're not just reading a script in your life, that you're actually helping make up your life as you go, and that your life is what we would call open-ended. Like, it doesn't have a definitive outcome. You're not exactly sure where it's going. There's a sense of adventure in autonomy, where the story of your life might not take a predictable turn. It might go somewhere different depending on how you react to it yourself. Look at some passages now from the book. This one involves Jack discussing why he gives himself the name Jack, and it refers to an author named Jack London, who wrote these kind of macho, Alaska Western-based, animal-based, tough guy kind of stories of people ruggedly dealing with nature and surviving at the face of great odds. And he says, I believe that having his name, namely Jack London's name, I believe that having his name would charge me with some of the strength and competence inherent in my idea of him. So at a minimum, this gives us a sense, right, that Jack in the book craves competence. He craves fortitude, the ability to deal with problems, because his life has a lot of problems. And he would like to be the kind of character who has the skills that he needs to make his way in his difficult world. And as we know, Jack doesn't really have competence. So in many ways, this book is sort of about the psychological effects of an ambitious boy who doesn't have the kind of competence that he needs. So this passage really gets at how psychologically damaging a lack of confidence can be, because often we're not even aware of what's bothering us. So this is when Jack is moving around the country as a young man. As a boy, I was subject to fits of feeling myself unworthy. There was no reason for me to have this feeling. I thought I'd left it back in Florida, together with my fear of fighting and my shyness with girls. But here it was, come to meet me. And so, he doesn't know, like, why should I feel unworthy? I'm not unworthy. But at some level, he's starting to realize that he can't do what he needs to do. He's not having success in his life. And at one level, you don't want to be unworthy because of that, right? But on the other hand, once you start realizing that you can't keep up, that you can't do what you need to do, it's going to start having psychological effects. You're going to start feeling bad, even though it's not necessarily your fault that you don't have those competencies. So competence is really important. Boys at St. Mark's who have high degrees of competence tend to be very happy boys. And as kids get older, when they can't do some things, especially if they don't really excel at anything, it often takes its toll. And so here's a third passage where Jack is talking about how he feels good when he takes care of his mom. Sometimes his mom would drink too much and get sick, and Jack would take care of her. And he's wondering, why does this make me so happy? He says, not because she was unhappy, but because she needed me. And to be needed made me feel capable. Soothing her soothed me. So again, just more evidence of how important in this book competence is, right? Jack doesn't have a lot of competence. As he grows older, he gets less and less competitive relative to other kids and the kind of kids who are going to grow into the adults that he wants to be. So here's a case where, he can help his mom. It makes him feel capable. All he's doing is just sort of holding her while she's passed out. It doesn't take exactly a lot of skill to do that. But the very fact that he can actually accomplish something caring for another person actually makes him feel really happy. And for whatever it's worth, in life, people who can take care of their people feel a great deal of life satisfaction, and people who can't don't feel that satisfaction. So now we move on to relatedness and how important it is. So here's a quotation from Jack, and this could be, if you think about it, any number of people in his life, but Dwight in particular is probably the one that was his great enemy. But anyway, we hated each other. We hated each other so much that other feelings didn't get enough light. It disfigured me. So if you try to think that like everybody's just their own independent person and they can feel however they want, it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. That we actually are social beings. We've just been biologically wired to be social. So our relatedness, our relations to other people are essential to our own identity, and with the quality of those relationships and the quantity of those relationships has a huge impact on our own happiness in our lives and our own productivity and our own sense of ourselves. So here Jack is realizing that his own terrible relatedness to some key people in his life is actually holding him back in a huge way. You know, how he would deal with that or should deal with that is its own question. But the very fact that we're related and we have to intentionally cultivate those relationships and try to make them go as well as possible is an essential part of being a satisfied person. So this deals with the other side of the issue, and this is when Jack's talking to the alum of his school that he wants to go to late in the book, the Hill School, and he says as follows: the members of his class grew close in ways that he had never thought possible until they were more like brothers than friends. It came, he said, from the simple fact of sharing the same life for a period of years. It made them a family. That was how he thought of the school now, as his second family. And so there's a kind of relatedness that you could probably relate to. Our seniors generally feel that way when they graduate, and often they stay in touch with their classmates and have best friends from St. Mark's for the rest of their lives. And those friendships are hugely important to the well-being of our graduates, and often independent schools have that effect. And so Jack is longing for that, right? He's like, I don't have that kind of relatedness. That's exactly what I want. So that's one of the reasons he wants to go to the Hill School. So we move on to autonomy now, which is hugely important to Jack, in part because the other aspects aren't going so well, right? So he says, I didn't come to Utah to be the same boy I had been before. I had my own dreams of transformation, Western dreams of freedom and dominion and taciturn self-sufficiency. So, in many ways, part of Jack's problem is his insistence on autonomy above and beyond the other elements of thriving. But then on the other hand, had he done better at those, he might not insist so much on his autonomy. Because if you don't have competence and relatedness, then autonomy can be sort of a way you cook your own goose, right? You think you could do it alone, but it turns out, people really can't. There's two more. Jack says, I was caught up in my mother's freedom, her delight in her freedom, her dream of transformation. So she overplays autonomy in her own life, also probably because of a lack of competence and relatedness. And so he gets caught up in the downdraft of her need to move around, and that tugs him around. And so she's trying to be a good mom, but she's also trying to be this independent person and make her own choices. And obviously there's a conflict there. And then going back to a quotation we already looked at once already, he says, I believe that having his name, namely Jack London's name, would charge me with some of the strength and competence inherent in my idea of him. And remember, we talked about that in terms of competence, but also, he's giving himself his own name, right? Which is a huge act of autonomy. And so it breaks relations to the world, right? Those relations are often given, right? You already have a name. We have names. We have histories. And so one of the things about these three elements of thriving is that they actually have to get along, and they need to be in proportion. Talk about some of these potential conflicts now. So first, what are we to do if in order to have autonomy later, we need to build competence now that we don't necessarily want to build? Like, do you really want to be sitting in class in school all day, every day, like you are? I mean, you're learning really important stuff. You're going through a process that society is based on, right, for you to eventually thrive, but it's not so great now. So do you cut corners now? Do you insist on your own autonomy now? or do you actually hack your way through and develop the competences in math and history and all these things, even if you don't plan on being a mathematician or historian, so that later, after going through the whole process, you'll have the autonomy to pick your own job, for instance. So moving on, what are we to do if we need to decide between keeping a relationship or developing competence? What if you have a best friend? Should you go to the same college? What if that college isn't the best for you? What if you wouldn't have gone there if it wasn't for a friend? Or what's going to happen if you're in love someday and your girlfriend or boyfriend is going to be a lawyer in New York and you want to go to med school in Austin? What do you do then, right? Do you see these things are potentially a huge conflict? And then finally, what are we to do if our own needs for autonomy conflict with the needs for autonomy of someone we're responsible to care for? So, this would be like the case with Jack's mom. She's responsible for nurturing Jack, and she's also responsible for developing her own autonomy. She usually chooses her own autonomy, right? And then look at the effect on Jack. So, these things are always in potential of conflicting. On the other hand, there's often great synergies between the three. So, for instance, at St. Mark's, it happens all the time. You do a sport and you make friends on the team, right? You make friends on the football team, and so you started because you had an interest. You made an autonomous decision to join football, and you end up related to a bunch of people because of that decision. And then because you're related to those people, maybe one of them sort of pulls you over onto the newspaper staff. And then you love that. You become a good writer and a good journalist and a good interviewer, and you develop a bunch of competence. So more often than not, that's how it works, that these actually play off each other in really positive ways. So finally, the takeaways. What are the three elements of thriving according to self-determination theory? What does competence mean and why is it important for thriving? What does relatedness mean and why is it important for thriving? What does autonomy mean and why is it important for thriving? How might these three elements of thriving be at odds with each other? How might these three elements of thriving have synergies between them? How do these three elements of thriving play out in Jack's life? Which, if any, does he have? Which, if any, does he lack? What are the effects of him having these elements or not?